Why can't the United States get its proxy, its client state, effectively its employee Israel under control? Why is that the one thing that's never on the table? That was Tucker Carlson. Not a progressive, not an anti-war activist, not someone with a history of criticizing Israel from the left. Tucker Carlson, the most watched conservative media figure in America. And what he just said is the question that changes everything. Stay until the very end of this video. Because the final number, the one that reveals exactly who is running this war and who is not, is the number no network will say out loud. Pay close attention to what comes next, because this is the part that never made it into the headlines. The ceasefire lasted 4 hours. Donald Trump had announced it himself. A 2-week pause. The Strait of Hormuz would open. Negotiations would begin. The killing would stop. For 4 hours it looked like the war that had already taken 13 American lives and blocked the world's most critical oil passage might finally be moving toward an exit. Then Israel dropped 100 bombs on Lebanon in 10 minutes. Not one bomb. Not a targeted strike. 100 bombs in 10 minutes. While the ceasefire Trump had personally announced was still technically in effect, while the ink on the announcement was still wet, while the families of 13 dead American soldiers were still waiting to understand what their loved ones had died for. 254 people were killed. Almost all of them civilians. Not a single Hezbollah militant was confirmed among the dead. 100 bombs. 10 minutes. 254 people. And then Donald Trump called Benjamin Netanyahu and asked him to chill out. Those were the words the President of the United States used. Chill out. To the leader of a country that had just dropped 100 bombs on civilians during a ceasefire that America had brokered. Chill out. And Netanyahu's response came hours later. Not privately. Publicly. In Hebrew for his own audience. There is no ceasefire in Lebanon. We continue to strike Hezbollah with full force, and we will not stop. The President of the United States said chill out. The Prime Minister of Israel said no. Read that again. Because that sentence contains the entire story of this war. Now pay very close attention. Because what Tucker Carlson said next is the moment this video exists.
And so the United States has to, and hopefully the first thing we do when and if this war is resolved, is detach from Israel. Not declare war on Israel or treat Israel as an enemy. They may treat us as an enemy, as they have before. When they tried to sink the USS Liberty, an American naval vessel, a surveillance vessel, they treated us as an enemy. We don't have to treat them as an enemy, however, and we shouldn't. But we should treat them like we treat every other country. As an ally, but with restrictions and reservations and red lines. No, you can't act against our interest. And this distancing should begin with a total end of aid of any kind, military or economic, to Israel.
That question, why can't the United States get Israel under control, is not a rhetorical question. It has a specific answer, and the answer is not complicated. It is just expensive to say out loud. In the last election cycle, pro-Israel donors gave to 94% of Congress. They gave $337 million to Donald Trump. They control what gets said on television, what gets printed in newspapers, and what gets discussed in Senate hearings. Not through conspiracy, through money. Legalized money. Campaign contributions that are technically legal and functionally identical to the purchase of a policy position. Tucker Carlson knows this. He said it. On camera. With his name attached. And the weight of that moment cannot be understated. Because Tucker Carlson did not arrive at this position casually. He spent years building a media empire on the premise that America's enemies were domestic. The left, the establishment, the media, the deep state. He was not someone whose default position was skepticism of American foreign policy commitments. He was not someone who questioned alliances. He was someone who believed in American strength and American power and American sovereignty. And then he watched the ceasefire last 4 hours. And he watched Trump say, chill out. And he watched Netanyahu say no. And he watched 13 Americans come home in flag-draped coffins while the country that had pushed for this war continued bombing its neighbors and ignoring the president who had just asked it to stop. And something changed. Not in the facts. The facts had always been there. Something changed in what Tucker Carlson was willing to say out loud about them. That is significant. Not because Tucker Carlson's opinion is the final word on anything, but because when someone who has spent their entire career on one side of a debate crosses the room and stands next to the people they have spent years arguing against, the question is not why they moved. The question is what they saw that made staying impossible. He saw a president call an ally and ask it to stop bombing civilians during a ceasefire. He saw the ally say no. He saw the president accept that answer. He saw no consequences follow. No reduction in aid. No diplomatic rebuke. No official statement expressing anything stronger than the request to be a little more low-key. He saw the entire machinery of American foreign policy respond to a foreign government's open defiance of a presidential request with nothing. And he asked the question that nothing produces. Why can't we control them? The answer was already in the public record. Tucker Carlson found it. And then he said it. And he was not alone. In exactly 30 seconds, you're going to hear the second voice. A voice that spent years on the opposite side of every political debate Tucker Carlson ever participated in. A voice that has nothing in common with Tucker Carlson except one thing. The answer to the question Tucker just asked.
When your ankles swell up 3 times the size they were before, that means heart failure. And he does look sick. And he does babble and, sound like the brain's not doing too hot. And so we just cut bait on Trump. And we just mobilize against the Democrats. This is not funny. This is not good. But he's gone. And that's it.
There it is. Alex Jones, Tucker Carlson. 2 men who have never agreed on anything sitting on opposite ends of the American political spectrum, arriving at the exact same conclusion at the exact same moment. Not because they coordinated. Not because someone told them what to say. Because the facts on the ground are no longer deniable from any direction. The ceasefire was announced. Israel bombed Lebanon. Trump said chill out. Netanyahu said no. 13 Americans are dead. The Strait of Hormuz is blocked. Oil prices are climbing. And the 2 most prominent voices in conservative media are now saying the same thing that the progressive left has been saying for years. Something is wrong, and everyone can see it. Think about what it means when these 2 men end up in the same place. Tucker Carlson built his career telling his audience that the left was the enemy. Alex Jones built his career telling his audience that the globalists were coming. They disagreed on almost everything. They represented opposite ends of a political divide that has defined American media for 20 years. Their audiences do not overlap. Their methods do not overlap. Their histories do not overlap. And yet here they are, saying the same thing, at the same moment, about the same war. That kind of convergence does not happen because of ideology. It happens because of evidence. When the evidence becomes so clear that it cannot be filtered through a political framework anymore, when the facts on the ground override the narrative that has been constructed to explain them away, people who should not agree start agreeing. Not because they have suddenly become allies, but because reality has a way of producing consensus when it becomes impossible to ignore. The ceasefire lasted 4 hours. That is not a left-wing talking point. That is a timestamp. 100 bombs in 10 minutes. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is a documented military action that happened while a presidential ceasefire announcement was still technically in effect. 254 civilians killed. That is not propaganda from either side. Those are bodies. And Trump said, chill out. And Netanyahu said no. And both Tucker Carlson and Alex Jones looked at that exchange and arrived at the same conclusion independently and said it out loud at the same time. When that happens, the question is not whether they are right. The question is what it means that it took this long for anyone with their reach to say it. Now drop your answer in the comments. Tucker, Alex Jones, and Cenk all reaching the same conclusion. Does that change anything for you? Does it matter when the left and the right finally agree? Tell us below. Because what comes next in this video is the piece that explains why none of this will change unless something very specific happens first. Pay close attention. This is the part no network will explain. The peace negotiations were scheduled for Saturday. J.D. Vance, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner. Those are the names on the American side of the table. And that combination of names tells you everything you need to know about what those negotiations are actually designed to produce. Steve Witkoff is a real estate developer with no foreign policy experience whose primary qualification appears to be personal proximity to Donald Trump. Jared Kushner is the president's son-in-law whose previous Middle East negotiations produced the Abraham Accords, a series of agreements celebrated as a historic peace breakthrough that did not include the people the conflict is actually about. And J.D. Vance, who was supposed to represent the America First wing of this administration, went on camera and said that ending the war in Lebanon was never part of the ceasefire. It was part of the ceasefire. The Pakistani Prime Minister said so. Donald Trump said so. The documentation exists. J.D. Vance looked into a camera and said the opposite. And meanwhile, Israel carpet-bombed Lebanon. And Trump posted a statement saying all U.S. ships, aircraft, and military personnel would remain in place around Iran until a real agreement was reached. And if it was not reached, the shooting would start bigger and better and stronger than anyone has ever seen before. This is the man negotiating peace.
I talked to Tucker Carlson about it, and here we are. He's saying the same thing. Ro Khanna now is saying the same thing. So when you can, please go to notanotherdollar.com and sign that pledge to never vote for anyone who gives another dollar to Israel and get the whole country on board with this. Anna, tell us the details.
Here is the number that no one will say on television. 60% of Americans now have a negative view of Israel. 84% of Democrats. And the politicians who represent those Americans, the ones who are supposed to go to Washington and carry the voice of the people who elected them, voted in the Democratic National Services Committee to allow AI-PAC dark money to continue flowing into their own primaries. Let that land for a moment. 84% of Democratic voters have a negative view of Israel, and the Democratic Party just voted to keep AI-PAC dark money in its own primaries. That is not a miscommunication. That is not a policy disagreement. That is a party that has looked at its own voters, understood exactly what they want, and voted for the opposite because the people writing the checks wanted something different. That is what purchase looks like in a democracy. Not a dramatic moment, not a scandal, a committee vote, a procedural decision. Something that happens in a room most people will never hear about, producing an outcome that contradicts the will of 84% of the people the committee is supposed to represent. And then the news cycle moves on, and the money keeps flowing. And the next election cycle begins with the same donors, and the same candidates and the same outcomes dressed in different language. This is not a Republican problem or a Democratic problem. It is an architecture. The same architecture that produces pro-Israel votes from 94% of Congress, regardless of which party controls it. The same architecture that produced $337 million flowing to Donald Trump from the same family whose interests now appear to be dictating American foreign policy in the Middle East. The same architecture that makes Tucker Carlson's question, "Why can't we control them?" so difficult to answer without also answering a deeper question about who controls the people who would have to do the controlling. The math is not complicated. The math is just expensive to say out loud. Tucker Carlson sees it. Alex Jones sees it. Cenk Uygur has been saying it for 20 years. The polls show that 60% of Americans see it. And the politicians whose salaries those Americans pay are voting to keep the money flowing. That is the number. That is the answer to Tucker's question. That is why Israel cannot be controlled. Not because it is impossible, because controlling Israel would require saying no to the people who fund the careers of the people who would have to do the controlling. And in American politics, you do not say no to the people who fund your career. You cash the check and you vote the way you are told. The ceasefire lasted 4 hours, 100 bombs in 10 minutes, 254 civilians. Trump said chill out. Netanyahu said no. And on Saturday, Jared Kushner sat down at a negotiating table to discuss peace in a war that the country paying for his father-in-law's political career does not want to end. Tucker asked the question. Alex Jones named the problem. Cenk showed you the math. The only question left is what you do with the answer.